So yeah, today's talk, I'm going to be talking a bit about a method that is very close to my heart. This is the method of fictocriticism, but also a genre of fiction that's very close to my heart, which is dystopian fiction. But before we get going, I'll just sort of position myself within this. So I'm a father of two. I've got a 6-year-old son, a 3-year-old daughter. The topic of my research is around parents at work. So I research it, but I also live it. And that is very important to the method that I'll be talking about. I'll go into the details of that, but suffice to say, so yes, I'm a dad at work, but I'm also married. I am a cisgender white man. I'm able-bodied. I kind of experience most of the privileges that are rendered to people within Western society, but I care deeply about social justice. And I consider myself to be a feminist and also an involved father. It's something I care about. So these are dimensions of how I come to this research, and they inform how I do this research and why I do it as well. Today we're going to go through a few elements. I'm going to briefly speak to the context, and that's just to kind of situate why I do this method. Then I'll talk a bit about what it is, the fictocriticism method, and then pivot that towards dystopian fiction. So why and how I've incorporated that into the method. And then part of that is the kind of steps along the road in order to achieve that, including a critical discourse analysis. Just I'll briefly speak to that. Then I've got some extracts from the book that I got published in 2023, and then I'll, right at the end, briefly speak to the kind of the material outcomes of that, what it led me to beyond the writing. To begin with, let's just remind ourselves of some of the wealth of literature out there. This is just indicative. There's a huge amount of research that's happened over decades talking about parents at work. Obviously, we can think back to Simone de Beauvoir in the sort of mid-20th century, but going through the feminist movement. I've kind of thought about this, thinking about 3 dimensions for the kind of intersection with parenthood and paid work. And I always emphasize paid when I think about parents at work, because as we well know, much work is undertaken which is unpaid work, unpaid labor, specifically within the family, home, or domestic contexts. So the 3 dimensions that are kind of concern the context for this book are the idea of a gendered hierarchy in the workplace, and that kind of connects with Acker's work dating back 35 years now, but equally ideas of a kind of a hostile workplace that privileges the ideal worker, the worker who is unencumbered by caring responsibilities or has minimal caring responsibilities and focuses on kind of being productive in their paid context. So that's the gendered hierarchy, and it tends to privilege the idea of a hegemonic masculine model of an ideal, a male worker. So related to that is the idea of a motherhood penalty, and there's much research that has kind of highlighted that both quantitatively and qualitatively, both in terms of the raw statistics in recent times. We know the Office of National Statistics have recently had a report kind of showing the real divergence of wage when women become mothers compared to men. And this kind of dates back, again, a lot of research over the last 20 years at least. And it's been more popularized by public figures like Jolie Brearley as well. There's an excellent book about the concept. And the final kind of the triad is, and something that I'm particularly interested in as well, is the idea of fatherhood at work, and the idea of a fatherhood forfeit, and that being connected to stigmatization, and the ideas of a care deficit. So to unpack that, it's dads who want to be involved feeling that they are discouraged or indeed forcefully persuaded not to be taking reduced hours, flexible working. It all speaks to a discourse in the workplace that has a level of hostility. And in recent papers by Jasmine Kelland, it's really kind of highlighted that. But there are other papers as well out there that kind of speak to that idea of, there's a Gatrell and colleagues and Bradley talking about the idea of a ghost in the machine, like fathers being kind of marginalized at work. So all this speaks to a masculine discourse in the workplace, and that's one of the themes that I wanted to kind of draw out on my own research. But one of the things that I wanted to really highlight is that with all this research, not much has changed. We've not seen this radical shift where everything's wonderful in the workplace. We don't see, regardless of how much evidence is out there, and it's growing all the time, the workplace still remains quite a hostile place for parents and policies. Although in some organizations they are starting to move in that direction, the vast majority are not, and a lot of the time that is contingent on policy but also culture. So that's why I have thought about how I might research it differently and take more of a kind of a storytelling approach. So that's the kind of the starting point for thinking about doing research differently, and particularly the idea of a ficto-criticism. And to begin with, it's to kind of position that as a disruptive approach to doing research, specifically in the feminist area. So I've put a definition on here that is one of the ones I kind of crafted myself in the book, but I would just like to emphasize there is not one way of doing a ficto-criticism. It is, by its very nature, kind of genre bending. It is within that feminist writing differently tradition, which is breaking boundaries, breaking frontiers of writing and thinking about how we understand the experience of gender in the workplace, how we understand feminist theorizing, and how we express that. But taking some of these ideas, it certainly is important to be situated in feminism. It is a storytelling approach to academic writing. That's how I interpret it. So others take different approaches, more poetic perhaps. I try and blend the two worlds of academic scholarship and also fictional writing. And yeah, that is my way of doing it. For my background, I have a master's in creative writing, and I've enjoyed doing kind of creative writing in the past myself. So I kind of draw on some of those preferences in the way I write, and that infuses how I write. But that you don't need to have that background to do this. It's just that's probably how I came to it, wanting to connect those two worlds a bit more. So the way I have kind of refined ficto-criticism, and actually just to mention, I should have said that, I'll go back to that slide again. Ficto-criticism, its origins is in the Australian feminist movement in kind of writing differently, and came through in the 1990s. And that was very much infused with fictional writing and poetic writing. I'd probably say it was an attempt to be more radical with writing in academic space in Australia. But it was Carl Rhodes' article in 2015 that really kind of draw my attention to it, and I'd recommend that one. Romancing Fictocriticism is a really good article. So yeah, my approach. I wanted my fictocritical writing to be really disruptive and to be challenging and critical. And I've always been drawn to the genre dystopian fiction. In fact, my undergraduate dissertation was about dystopian fiction, and kind of went full circle when I ended up using that with this approach. What I like about dystopian fiction is that it is speculative, but also it shines a light on the now and the past, a critical perspective on a now. And the critical dystopia, which is described by Bacalini and Moylan, is much more aligned with feminist approaches. So with a critical perspective, but also an orientation towards how do we change it? How do we resist it? And that's really important. And I'll just speak to that in the next slide, but one element of dystopian fiction that I think helps it differ from a lot of other genres, and that's why it's a useful framework, is that it can play with temporality. It can play with the past, the present, and the future. And you can move between those time frames when you write in a way that other genres often kind of stay in a particular time. But I really like that because it helps you to look at the now in a different way, and it helps you to appreciate how you got to the now and where you might be heading. So that's one of the key things that I talk a bit about in the book as well. Why dystopian fiction? So this is when I was doing my PhD, I started with, well, what even is a dystopian fiction, and tried to map that out a bit. This is a condensed version of the mapping that I did. So it kind of went in a spider diagram, but some of the big themes that came out when I was trying to understand what the different novels talk about, what their themes are, and how might that inform what I'm doing. So I started thinking mainly about gender in the workplace, and I wanted to think, well, how might dystopian fiction help me think about that? What are the lessons I can learn from the fiction, and to give the fiction a kind of a platform that's important rather than like a frivolous thing. And some of the big themes that when I started to think about it were the idea of infertility and fertility, and that's present in quite a lot of prominent dystopian fictions, including The Handmaid's Tale, but also The Children of Men, and more recently novels like Red Clocks. That became a really important way in for me. Other concepts of like the ideology of masculinity and sort of subjugation of women. There's also the idea of control of language and physical control. But really important to my feminist ideas of how I might do this is the idea of subversion and how you might resist and push for change. So these strands helped me really narrow down what I was going to do. But equally, at the time when I was doing this thinking, I also was becoming a dad. And that really informed what I wanted to focus on. And becoming a parent myself, I became part of my own research in a way I was living it as well as thinking about it. So this was my way into considering how a gendered organization might be experienced and what it might mean. So it led me to a kind of a general conceptual framework, which was around parenthood, masculinities, and subversion. So just to emphasize, I've got masculinities on here. And yes, I've mentioned this kind of hierarchy of hegemonic, the dominant form of masculinity at the top, which subjugates other forms of masculinity and femininity. But I think about masculinities as a spectrum, and I would consider myself more aligned with caring masculinities. But there is a whole way of being a man, or having masculinities within the gender spectrum as well. Of course, female masculinity as well. So that was a way of unpacking some of that in terms of workplace discourse. So how did I do this? So I did interviews with couples who were becoming parents within a time frame. It was 10 couples, although one, it was just the father, so 19 in total. But I spoke to them individually and to get their experiences of being and their expectations of becoming parents, and to try and connect that with a single workplace, so to get a sense of how they all experienced that same workplace, both as workers of, but also connected with as partners. And that was undertaken during 2019 and into early 2020, so just before the pandemic really hit. But that certainly became a bit more of a factor as I went on. So I'm going to just break down for me the how of the ficto-criticism part before I get into some of the steps as well. And I've kind of articulated this as 5 R's. So the first one is a sense of responsibility that you have as a researcher. It's a responsibility for the stories of the parents at work. So ficto-criticism is about trying to make the story, create a new story, but you have a responsibility to that story, and to take responsibility for the research itself. And also for the relatedness, so thinking about some of those concepts that I've already mentioned, some of the context, and trying to blur the lines between the fiction that you create, but also the fact that you're trying to hold true as well. And actually, that idea of fiction and fact is very important in the genre of dystopian fiction. Margaret Atwood, one of her principles of writing is that anything that she includes within her really prominent novels has occurred in the past. So The Handmaid's Tale, all the kind of horrible dystopian ideas are all represented in the past. They are artifacts of things that have really happened, and then we've seen them happen again. Another dimension that I draw upon is reflexivity. So I consider my own authorial role. I'm an arbiter of these lived experiences, but I also have my own lived experience. So trying to be conscious of that as I write and as I think and as I produce, so that reflexivity is present throughout. Now, because it's a ficto-criticism, a fictional representation, I want it to be resonant. I want it to feel real. I want it to feel like I understand, I recognize that experience. And partly having lived it myself, that infuses what I write. But it's very much drawn on the narratives of the parents I spoke to. And that final point, resisting, to me, a dystopian fictocriticism, so a dystopia being the bad place in the future for the majority of people. We want to have an idea of, we don't just accept this, we resist it. What is the resistance? What happens to change the culture and the structure? How might that come about? And so this is all principles that I try to follow. And so if we think about this as a flow, I start from that social justice perspective that I have. I consider ideas of ideology and masculinity and how ideologies are reproduced. Then the qualitative interviews, and then analyze the data with critical discourse analysis to pull out some themes, and then it's into the writing differently. So that critical discourse analysis is the kind of rigorous point, that kind of responsibility that I took to make sure I represented the data correctly. This isn't just purely a fun, let's just create a fiction. It's really based in the empirical data. It's really important to emphasize that. And so this is just one extract from that critical discourse analysis that I undertook. And I looked at the data using Fairclough's approach, the dialectical relational consideration of how people construct their ideas of parenthood. And this is kind of more of a traditional example of a mother's perception of their partner. And she spoke about some of these kind of ideologies of hunter-gatherer, the gendered coding of a father who wants to be a provider, and even like cultural symbols of like Batman, and really emphasizing the male. So I connected that with ideas of like the macro discourse of traditional masculinity, hegemonic masculinity. But then we see kind of the personal, the micro level of it. So the decision to go with that, not necessarily because they believe, but also just understanding human nature. But perhaps within some of that is the acceptance, the sort of internalization of this gender role. And one of the things I wanted to show with the writing is that a lot of the experience of gender is internalized and reproduced by men and women. And I used Althusser and interpolation, so becoming the subject and reproducing that through our language and through our behaviors and choices. That's something that we learn from birth. We are coded in gender ways from the moment we are born. We accept that call to become a parent. Like, what type of parent are we going to become? And we see that in society. Fathers become this, mothers become that, and we kind of walk into that role. So this person also spoke about accepting that it might be to the detriment of their career, but try not to let it be. but it's an interesting acceptance even before becoming a mother, like almost anticipating that it will be to the detriment, sort of knowing that the motherhood penalty is coming. And some of that, the quote itself is quite a powerful example of that kind of context that I spoke about. And so I wanted to find a way with quotes like this and on different themes to make that into a narrative and to develop that further to be more resonant. And so when I was mapping this, I started to think about, okay, at different levels of discourse, how might that intersect with ideas of masculinities, femininities, and subversion? And I kind of coded this a bit. When I look back at this, as a colorblind person, I don't know how I managed to color code something, but that might be why the colors might seem garish to you, because I tend to go for radically different colors. But yeah, I did that to kind of show relatedness between concepts. So I would have a map of a few different ideas for different levels of discourse. So that's a meso level for culture, but then you have a different theme that came out, which is about the parental club, and that was much more connected to ideas of subversion. So you had unique and welcoming subculture, solidarity, and unity, but then majority of women. So that then is slightly different theme as well. So these clusterings of themes help me to make a step towards creating a narrative. How would I kind of plot this story? What themes would I like to represent through narrative and characters? And I wanted to show what often I think qualitative data, though the quote itself can be really powerful, I wanted to try and fill in the gaps between the quotes. So how would I create a fuller feeling of what a patriarchal organization might be, a kind of hostile environment for parents? What would they experience? So this is just some examples of how I then developed that into characters. So one of the characters I wanted to represent would be an expectant father. And again, some of these themes are kind of coded in that way. Things like passivity to policy, some traditional father ideas, and then some kind of accepting of domestic responsibility as well. So there were grey characters. They're not always one thing. They had different dimensions to them. And here's an example of a mother. And just to mention, all the character names were taken from dystopian fiction, so that's why some of these names are a bit different. But some of these were kind of more coded for the kind of mother's experience of breastfeeding, particularly motherhood penalty, of course, and physical and emotional burden. But some of these codes came through from the empirical data itself, or they all did, so all grounded in that data. But these helped me to construct an idea of what that parent might be in the story, what they would have experienced, what they've embodied. So based on these characters that I constructed, I then wanted to make a plot and bring that together into something that might feel like a dystopian fiction. And to do that, I had to think about that time element again, future and past. I'll come to that in one moment, because before I do that, I wanted to just, I mentioned that my own story was very important. And throughout becoming a parent, I don't think anyone realizes quite how often your children get sick until you actually live it. And so with the writing of my own Fictocriticism, especially the book, I was experiencing just frequently phone calls from the nursery and looking after sick children and stuff like that. So this is to kind of illustrate my reality of being a dad. It's just a very brief poem that's in the book, but it's writing parenthood is writing illness. It is writing about cleaning up sick from the grey car seat fabric with a baby wipe, rubbing the smeared chunks and clumping them into a ball while my stomach churns. It is snatching moments to reflect while my son asks me questions. It is loading the washing machine with my daughter on my hip and watching the cycle begin. It is the process of cleaning, comforting, and caring. So that kind of tries to encapsulate some of my own experiences and how that informs what I then went on to write. So I mentioned that this has got a temporal element to it. So I'm going to embody the narrator now. And this is naturally there'll be parts of me that are this, but it's thinking forward 100 years. So we can imagine we've now become participants in a 2021 Societal Family History Symposium. And this is the device I've used to make it dystopian. So they're looking back at our present, and they've kind of thinking about the themes. Colleagues, welcome to the 10th annual Data Archaeology Conference on the 100th anniversary of the cloud crash. This is a very special occasion for us in the Working Family stream, and I'm very excited to share our latest findings with you today. Firstly, I want to thank our platform providers, G Corp, for allowing us to hold this conference on their servers. We have agreed to the scope of topic discussion in line with their free speech regulations. To start off today, let me take you back to the inciting incident and a brief history of our last century that has preceded our meeting today. In the 2020s plague of pandemics, the changes to the landscape of working parents occurred in ways no one could have predicted. Long established working norms were radically subverted and overthrown as one by one, each company and government took a leap of faith into a synergy with artificial intelligence. The working day was reimagined too. Gone was the old structure and rigidity of 9 till 5 working days, and in its place a new kind of flexibility emerged. Of course, one important aspect of working family life did not change. Babies were still born, and families still needed to determine their approach to childcare. With the working day untethered from synchronous working time, fathers embraced the opportunity to choose caregiving alongside work and realised Connell's vision of re-embodied masculinity. This, combined with the global healthcare crisis, sparked the great debate about revaluing the importance of care in our working lives. With the help of AI debate and logic simulations, the issue was definitively settled in 2035 with a new equal parenting law enacted through the Global Federation of Corporations, GFC. So that situates where we've got to in 100 years from now. Some utopian elements, some dystopian elements. The narrator is speaking about extracts that they've found in our now. After the cloud crash where all the data was locked away, they found an air-gapped computer where there was some data, so the data that I've collected. They've found this data and they've tried to piece it together. It's a bit garbled, but they've tried to make something of it. And they made it into a narrative. And so the first narrative is dropping off and changing hats. And this is the character Cormac, who's a dad. "We're here," Cormac exclaims, turning to Zoe with a beaming smile. She stares back with her best poker face. "Let's get you out of here," Cormac declares, and then narrates as he unbuckles Zoe's seatbelt and kisses her on the forehead. She babbles as he lifts her up and holds her on his side. Then he briskly walks over to the nursery entrance and waits behind another parent in the queue. Once inside, he tickles her tummy as he takes off her coat. "What are you going to do today?" he asks her as he takes her hand and they walk into the main room. "Horsey," she replies as she points at the circle of plastic farm animals on the ground. A crowd of toddling infants are already bumping into each other and playing with them. Two are wrestling with each other on the ground over a giraffe. Zoe slows down and holds Cormac's trouser leg. "It's okay, honey. Go on," Cormac whispers as he ushers her forwards towards a group of little ones encircling one of the carers. Zoe turns to him and tugs his trouser leg again, frantic to climb up. Her bottom lip is starting to quiver, and her eyes are imploring him to hold her. "Come on, little one. Look at this." Cormac forces himself to smile and points to an unclaimed horse figurine. It's chestnut brown with black hooves, and its forelegs are rearing in an action pose. Zoe tentatively approaches. He catches the eye of one of the carers who started talking to Zoe and is showing her a zebra. They smile back and he rushes across the room to the exit, turning to wave at Zoe as he leaves. She stares back at him, still frozen in between tears and engagement. The carer picks her up for a cuddle and Cormac walks away, taking a deep breath of the cold autumn air to wake himself up. "Okay, come on, let's get going," Cormac cajoles himself out of the twisting, wrenching feeling in his stomach. The campus beckons, and it's now 8:33. Just enough time to finish that report. Well, at least a rough draft before he's heading to class. He nips back to the car, stretches in to get his bag and a coffee, an absolute necessity. With each step away from the nursery, he feels his fuzzy, soft fatherhood hat slip from his brow. Time to strap on the worker helmet and head into the breach. So that narrative is very kind of connected to my own feeling, but also that kind of metaphor of hats was something that came through in the empirical data as well. Now, I mentioned this is genre blending, and there are papers about ghost of masculinity. So I wanted to kind of represent that in the fiction as well, and try and represent discourse of masculinity. So I did that in a kind of leaning into the genre of ghost stories as well. And the ghost of masculinity is the next narrative I want to speak about. It's the kind of feeling that I kind of picked up from lots of participants about this new norm of becoming a parent, or this feeling of what it might mean, especially in a workplace. The ghost of masculinity. A translucent, listless colony of grey suits hang like empty sacks from a metallic eaves of the corporate foyer. Inscribed inside each of the jacket collars are faded black letters that read Marley. Below, a bustling crowd of students stream inside the building, carrying bags, books, and drinks. Behind the melee, a dishevelled, bleary-eyed man lurches into the building and pauses to adjust his bag. One of the suits twitches and detaches from its ledge. Its jacket sleeves unfurl and spread outward, while its trouser legs, like slender wings, bend and thrust backwards, propelling it into a downward dive in pursuit of the man. He is wearing a grey jumper that hangs limply from his shoulders. He trudges towards the stairway, bent forward and cradling a dented aluminium mug. He stifles a yawn as he passes unnoticed through a swell of students heading toward the stairwell. They all gather outside the elevator doors, watching the digital numbers count down from 4, 3, 2. The air in the room is thick with perfumes, musk, body odor, and a murmur of humming chatter. He looks down and grimaces at the dry milk stain near his knee. Licking his thumb, he rubs the unironed material. Abandoning his effort, he retrieves his phone from his pocket. A woman and baby smile back at him in an idyllic, sunny beach setting. He pauses to look at them and smiles. He opens the photos folder on his home screen and starts to browse some of the recent family holidays as he waits. Marley passes through the wall next to the elevator doors and enters the waiting area. It settles in the air above the man, and the cuffs of the jacket arms extend out and latch into the man's shoulders like great wailing grapple hooks entering flesh. So this is representing the moment of shift, changing the hats, the feeling of becoming the worker, and that kind of ghostly presence in the workplace. The next extract is a different theme, speaking to the idea of the nursery calls when at work and who's responsible. And this is drawing on some of the data that I encountered. So this is one of the female character, a mother, and she's just on a phone call to the nursery. I'm teaching this afternoon. Is there any chance you can call my husband if anything changes? Yes, of course. Thank you, Toby says and ends the call. Toby checks the line. It's 2:30 and she has a class at 3. She opens her contact lists and presses call on the first name on the list. The call tone pulses in her ear and she presses her index finger into her thumb. Her feet are throbbing. The phone keeps ringing and then his answering machine begins. Hello, this is Chris. Sorry, I can't answer your call right now. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. She waits for the beep. It's me. Alfie's running a temperature and they've given him Calpol. I have a class in half an hour. I've asked them to call you if there's an update. Text me if anything changes. Love you. She hangs up and opens her messenger to transcribe the message to him via text. Then she leaves the toilet. She starts teaching on autopilot. It's a familiar lesson. Her mind is on Alfie. The students are slumped in front of her on their chairs, sipping on lattes and energy drinks. She reaches the first task and checks her phone while the students work in groups. There's a text message from Chris. It reads, "Sorry, I have meetings all afternoon. Can't get out with them. Is he okay?" She closes the message and pushes her phone away from her on the plinth. There are 20 minutes left until the end of the seminar, and she knows what is coming. That was really reflective of some of the kind of experiences of living that motherhood in work, and the spectre of the nursery calling, and I know that feeling as well. The dread. So those extracts really spoke to the idea of the masculine workplace, the gendered hierarchy of work, and that discourse of masculinity. I tried to depict that through lots of different narratives and characters. But one thing that I really wanted to draw out, and it was towards the end of the narrative, was this idea of subversion. And I encountered it with parents, collectivism, but in informal ways, like corridor conversations or people that you worked with in your office who also were parents and kind of got it, and they were kind of part of this parental club. And so I wanted to imagine what that might become. And so this is the kind of final extract. It's quite a brief one, but it's about the spirit of subversion and what that might lead to. And these are just three kind of people getting together and talking about what they need to do. "It's the urgency that's lacking," Julian says as she gets to her feet. "It's too easy for them to push these issues down the road, and months become years, years become decades. Meanwhile, more people go through what I'm experiencing right now. It's just more of the same old shit, isn't it? How many more exploited pregnancies are we going to tolerate on the altar of productivity and process before we draw a line in the sand? We want to show them we won't accept these norms anymore," Cormac declares. "Yes," Mary replies with a wide grin. Her fingers rhythmically rap on a bullet point list on her A4 pad. "They need to know we exist as a collective, that we aren't going away, that we stand in solidarity as one movement, and that we are here to demand change now. We can't keep flexing our lives to their rigid rules. I want them to see the other side of our lived experiences, to show them what being a working parent means." So that's the final extract that I'll share today. And that's kind of where it just inspired what I then have gone on to do. And I very briefly talked to this, is just from the writing and the experience of it was to actually organizing. And it's very consistent with the feminist approach, I would argue. So just briefly, I'd say around the end of my PhD, I established a network at Northumbria University for parents and carers. It was very much inspired by the dystopian fiction and the process of writing that and understanding what people were experiencing, and that there was a groundswell that in any organization there were parents who were living this and that would be of benefit. So I've gone through that from establishing it to organizing it, but also then researching it with a colleague, Anna Lopez at Newcastle University. We've developed that into connecting with other networks around the UK higher education sector. We've done a toolkit to help other networks grow and flourish. And we've then since become leaders of the national organisation called UK Pact. And we continue to have a presence and focus on agendas such as the 6 weeks paternity leave. And just to highlight some of the things that we found in our research with networks, kind of consistent with what I've just talked about through the ficto-criticism, but those gender stereotypes are there. And then the idea of men just having to justify their participation. So it's often women who are in these networks. So one of the things that I wanted to do through the networks and through this type of research is to try and reach out to dads and form dads groups. So more recently in 2023, I've established Dad Chat at Northumbria University, so a group particularly for dads, and tried to build from there. And that's important to kind of carve out a space for dads and give them a kind of way of talking about caring masculinity and involve fatherhood. But some of the things that are involved, it's challenging some of those gender stereotypes. And that's work that's really important to me in the now. And it's kind of a product of thinking in this way and adopting that dystopian mindset, but in writing that way as well, and trying to fill in the gaps and create a story. So I'm hoping that I've tried to make some of that story in my own way come to reality. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to have any questions at this point.